The silence in the penthouse on the 40th floor of the LA Premier Tower wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the hush of an apex predator waiting. It was always cold and always listening. Eliza Reyes, the housemaid, moved through the space like a whisper in her simple, serviceable gray uniform. She was meant to be invisible, disposable, and, above all, obedient. She existed to erase the evidence of life, leaving behind only the cold perfection of marble and glass. But tonight, a strange, undeniable tension, like the taut silence before a gunshot, pulled her past the heavy velvet rope and into Damien Rousseau's private study, a room she had strict, repeated orders never to enter after 11 p.m. It was a space built for lethal decisions, surrounded by mahogany shelves stocked with books she couldn't read and priceless antiques that screamed power. The air in there felt thick, suffocating, as if the oxygen had been replaced by secrets. She raised her feather duster, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, already guilty of an offense that could cost her the meager salary she sent back to her family in Miami. She had to be quick. She had to be silent. The risk was enormous, but the compulsion to breach the boundary was stronger than her fear. She needed to know what the silence was hiding. The light she was cleaning under exposed a faint metallic glint on the edge of the Don's desk, a clue she couldn't identify, a disruption in the seamless facade of his wealth. It was a smudge of silver, almost invisible, but out of place. This detail, this tiny imperfection, convinced her that his perfect, powerful life was starting to fracture. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, convinced she'd finally found the source of the penthouse's suffocating tension. Her hand was hovering inches from the desk, ready to touch the forbidden object and understand the danger, when the enormous, soundproof mahogany door was violently thrown inward. The deafening sound of wood meeting plaster echoed through the massive room, instantly wiping out the night's calculated silence. It was too late. The heavy mahogany doors flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening impact that shattered the penthouse's stillness. Damien Rousseau, the man who controlled the flow of every illicit dollar from Los Angeles to San Francisco, the undisputed boss, stumbled in. His tailored Italian suit, likely worth more than Eliza earned in a year, was immaculate, but his face was a mask of cold terror that made Eliza freeze mid-motion. He wasn't composed. He was desperately fighting for air, his breath hitching in his chest like a broken machine. This was an intimate, devastating attack, and the emergency contact console built into the wall was useless against it. His eyes, usually ice, were cloudy and wide with mortal fear as he collapsed onto the priceless Persian rug. He was clutching his throat, his powerful posture destroyed by a force no bodyguard could fight. The only sound in the vast room was his ragged, choked gasping. "Please, help me! They poisoned me!" He managed, his voice, usually a low, lethal instrument of command, reduced to a wet, terrifying rasp. He was clawing at the thick air, his knuckles white against the luxurious fibers of the rug as he desperately fought for a breath that wouldn't come. His body was convulsing in a silent, violent betrayal of its own strength. He was a god brought low, lying helpless on his own floor, his life leaking away in front of the one person he deemed too insignificant to matter. Eliza, the invisible, disposable maid, was the only person who could hear him, the only one who saw the ruthless Don reduced to a frightened, dying man. The contrast was sharp and brutal. The man who commanded thousands was now at the mercy of a girl in a cheap gray uniform. His eyes locked onto hers, no longer seeing a servant, but the last vestige of hope. His desperate plea, thick with the scent of high-grade whiskey and imminent death, hung heavy between them. He was utterly vulnerable, his fate placed squarely in the hands of the most overlooked person in his entire organization. For the first time, the power in the room shifted, resting not with the boss, but with the silent girl holding the feather duster. The moment stretched, demanding a choice that would determine not only his fate, but the complete destruction of her meticulously organized life. Eliza didn't scream or run. The paralysis of shock was overridden by the instant, ice-cold clarity of purpose. The scent hit her immediately, faint and chilling. Almonds. Cyanide, or a derivative. A slow, elegant killer designed to look like a sudden heart attack. She recognized the specific tremors, the cold sweat, and the rapid onset of shallow breathing, not from an emergency room textbook, but from years spent with her grandmother, an herbalist in Miami, who knew the difference between a bad shrimp and a betrayal. Her grandmother always said, "When the world is screaming, the cure is always silent." She bypassed the crystal carafe on the bar. Liquid would only accelerate the poison's spread. Instead, she ran to her service kitchen, ignoring the panic in Damien's fading eyes. She passed the industrial-sized refrigerators and the gleaming steel surfaces that masked the mansion's operation. Her destination was a small, cracked ceramic jar, her only personal possession in this gilded cage, containing a piece of her past life, hidden beneath the cleaning supplies. It contained a dark, intensely bitter paste, a powerful, foul-tasting binding agent made from activated charcoal and crushed herbs. It was a desperation cure, a dangerous gamble, but the boss was already drowning in his own air. She raced back, skidding on the polished floor, and knelt by the convulsing boss. Without a moment's hesitation, she uncapped the jar. Damien watched her, her pupils dilated with fear and suspicion. He tried to speak, but only a choked gurgle escaped. Eliza forced his jaw open and with surprising strength smeared the paste under his tongue. She had one chance. She knew that if she were wrong, if the concoction contained a single wrong ingredient, or if the poison was too far gone, she'd be remembered as the maid who finished the job. The entire weight of the Russo syndicate's suspicion would fall on her head. But the paste was working. The constriction in Damien's throat eased slightly. His eyes, still wide with terror, locked onto hers as he fought to spit out the bitterness. "What is that? What are you doing? Is that more poison? Do you work for the Mendozas?" He had survived, but now the real danger, his trust, began. Damien's eyes, glazed with suspicion and the lingering fire of the poison, locked onto hers as he fought violently to spit out the bitter paste. The taste was an offense to his palate, the entire situation an offense to his authority. "What is that? What are you doing?" he rasped, his voice tearing at his throat as he struggled against her small, surprisingly strong hand. "Is that more poison? Do you work for the Mendozas?" Every instinct he possessed screamed that the only person near him was his killer. Eliza held his gaze, refusing to flinch. Her fear was channeled into focused action, leaving her voice surprisingly steady. "If I wanted you dead, Don Russo, you would already be dead," she countered, the bold statement hanging heavy and dangerous in the air. The sheer audacity of the maid speaking such a threat gave him pause. "This will bind the toxin, but it won't last long. I am a housemaid, not an antidote. I am the only one who can save you, but you must trust me." The paste worked quickly, a miracle of desperate folklore against modern venom. His breathing deepened, and the sheer panic in his eyes was replaced by a cold, calculating curiosity. He was weak, his body still trembling, but his mind was already sharp, assessing the maid. He now knew she was no ordinary servant. She held the power of life and death over him. He was indebted, exposed, and absolutely furious. "You knew exactly what it was," Damien stated, his voice now low and lethal, regaining its terrifying control.
That paste is ancient. Who are you, and why are you working as a housemaid? Eliza did not break eye contact, understanding that honesty, or a very good version of it, was her only defense. I am Eliza Reyes. I work for the money. My grandmother was a healer. I saw the symptoms immediately. She offered no further details. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of his assessment. He was searching her face for weakness, for a hint of betrayal, but finding only focused, defiant resolve. He was forced to make a decision that contradicted every rule of his world: trust the unknown, disposable variable, or die. She had exposed his vulnerability, and now he needed her knowledge. The power of the entire Russo syndicate had just subtly shifted, resting not with the boss on the floor, but with the poor housemaid who chose to save him. Damien Russo slowly fought his way to a seated position, his massive frame radiating latent power even as he leaned heavily on Eliza. The subtle tremor in his hands was the only remaining evidence of his near-death experience. He looked down at his own trembling hands, then up at her in the simple gray uniform. His voice, though weak, was already regaining its lethal authority. "The poison was delivered inside this house," he stated, his gaze sweeping over the custom Italian marble and reinforced steel. "It had to be someone I trusted." His realization was a death sentence waiting to be delivered. The heavy mahogany doors, already ajar, flew completely open as two figures burst in. Jackson, the scarred second in command, a man built like a fortress with eyes that missed nothing, and Marcus, the young, impeccably dressed lawyer, whose calm demeanor was as unnerving as Jackson's aggression. Their eyes were instantly dark with suspicion as they saw the maid hovering over their boss, her hands still near his jaw. Their hands immediately went to their jackets, ready to eliminate the threat. Damien held up a hand, silencing them with a gesture that needed no words. He looked at the lieutenants, realizing that one of them was the snake, but he couldn't afford to guess wrong. He needed a neutral variable. He looked back at Eliza. "You clean every room. You see every paper. You hear every whisper. You are invisible," he told Eliza, his breath hot against her ear as he pulled her close, forcing her into the center of the confrontation. The intimacy was a terrifying display of ownership. "You are no longer a maid," he commanded, his eyes challenging Jackson and Marcus to object. "You have access to every room, every file, every servant. The traitor knows your face as nothing more than a cleaning lady. They will never suspect you." His eyes were intense, burning through her fear. "You are my eyes now." The proposition was a terrifying display of trust. Eliza felt the weight of Jackson's murderous suspicion and Marcus's calculating assessment. The air was thick with the silent understanding that her life was forfeit either way. "Fail, and I will execute you for treason," Damien finished, his voice a low, cold promise. "Succeed, and you name your price." Eliza was trapped. She was promoted from disposable servant to high-stakes spy, bound to a man whose life she had just saved, knowing the traitor was watching her every move. She glanced at the faces of the lieutenants, realizing her new office was a gilded cage, and her new colleagues were two men, one of whom was a killer. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the volatile, desperate trust of Damien Russo. Eliza's new role was sheer, agonizing paranoia. She was no longer just cleaning. She was investigating a near murder that happened in the most secure building in Los Angeles. Every dust cloth became a tool, every vacuum cleaner noise a strategic cover for eavesdropping. The atmosphere in the penthouse was thick with distrust, a toxic cocktail of fear and ambition. She was the weakest link, forced to act as the strongest detective. She observed the lieutenants with forensic precision, noting every tick and gesture. Jackson was fiercely protective of Damien, his suspicion of Eliza so palpable it was a constant physical threat. His scarred face remained a wall of antagonism, his movements always positioning himself between her and the boss. Conversely, Marcus, the lawyer, was dangerously calm, always offering a smooth rationalization for any security breach. His eyes, though polite, held a calculating chill that never warmed. Eliza relied on the small, forgotten details only a maid would see. A book slightly misplaced after a private meeting, a code scribbled on a napkin and then hastily erased, a tiny smudge of dirt in the air conditioning vent in the private dining room, evidence of subtle, unauthorized access. These were the only truths she could trust. She felt the heavy, undeniable certainty that Damien was watching her on his internal security feed. His gaze was a physical weight on her back, assessing her every movement, her every nervous sigh, perpetually assessing her loyalty. The house was no longer a workplace, it was a trap, and she was the bait. She was the one who could expose the traitor, and therefore the one the traitor would move to eliminate next. Every hour she spent sweeping up dust brought her closer to finding the snake, but also closer to the venom. The silence of the penthouse had become her greatest enemy, amplifying the footsteps, the hushed phone calls, and the relentless ticking of her own impending deadline. In her surveillance, Eliza noticed a damning, dangerous pattern. Every Tuesday, without fail, Damien would slip out of the penthouse. He left his security detail, including the watchful, hostile Jackson, behind, claiming a private meeting that was never on his encrypted schedule. It was an inexcusable, monumental risk for a mafia boss with a confirmed target on his back, a move that felt reckless, even suicidal, suggesting a vulnerability greater than the poison itself. Using her new, illicit access to his primary encrypted systems, Eliza risked everything by activating his car's hidden GPS tracker. If she was caught tampering with his security infrastructure, her execution would be swifter and less merciful than the poison. The isolation and tension of those Tuesday mornings were overwhelming. She was committing espionage against the man who owned her life. The tracker's screen, usually static, flashed to life with a moving cursor. The signal led her far from the usual business districts, the dark alley meetings, and the upscale restaurants where the syndicate conducted its business. It led her out of Los Angeles entirely, down the coast, past the usual haunts of the city's elite, and continued south, deep into San Diego. This was not a meeting, it was a pilgrimage. The drive was almost 3 hours one way, a vast, exposed window of time, perfect for an ambush. The destination was baffling, unsettling, and completely out of character for the Dawn. He was sacrificing his safety, his routine, and his entire structure for something he wouldn't share even with his most trusted men. Eliza realized this Tuesday secret was the key to finding the traitor, because it was the key to Damien Russo's heart. She knew she had to follow the trail, putting herself in immense danger. The cursor finally stopped, resting on a map marker that defied every assumption she had made about the ruthless boss. Eliza followed the GPS signal to a small, unassuming children's hospital in downtown San Diego, a place utterly devoid of the Russo family's usual opulence. The building was quiet, stark, and filled with the hushed dread of illness, a stark contrast to the opulent, deadly silence of the penthouse. Disguised in a generic hoodie and surgical mask, Eliza slipped inside, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was deep in enemy territory, far from her familiar world of cleaning supplies and surveillance cameras. She navigated the silent corridors, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. She found Damien not in a secluded private wing, but in a sterile, brightly lit room, tucked away from the main thoroughfare. He wasn't conducting business, barking orders, or exuding the terrifying authority of the dawn. He was sitting patiently by the bedside of a young girl. No older than 8, the child was impossibly fragile, her tiny body attached to a dozen life support wires, fighting a catastrophic illness. The small chest rose and fell with the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. The child, however, had Damien's distinct emerald eyes, the same striking, piercing gaze that could freeze a man where he stood, and his strong, aristocratic features softened by the innocence of childhood. This wasn't a family friend or an obligation. This was his daughter, Isabella. Damien Rousseau, the cold, ruthless Don, was a desperate, heartbroken father. Eliza watched, unseen as he gently adjusted her blanket, his enormous, intimidating frame hunched over the tiny bed, his guard completely down. He ran a massive hand over her pale forehead, his jaw tense with an emotion Eliza recognized as pure, agonizing fear, the same fear she'd seen in his eyes when he believed he was dying. He kissed her forehead, a gesture that twisted Eliza's gut. This profound, unspoken love was his most devastating secret, his ultimate, unbearable weakness. The realization shattered Eliza's perception of him, the ruthless man who commanded an empire, who dealt in death and power, had a soft underbelly so vulnerable it defied everything she knew about him. He was a monster, yes, but also a father terrified of losing his child. This wasn't just a secret, it was the key to his very existence. He had built an entire fortress around his public persona, but here, in this quiet room, his true heart lay exposed and unprotected. Eliza knew that this secret, once exposed, could bring the entire Russo empire crashing down, and she was the only one who now held that terrible power. The full, terrifying scope of his vulnerability was laid bare before her. The shock was immense, a physical blow to Eliza's stern resolve. She quickly slipped away from the room's window, her disguise and her mission forgotten, realizing the terrifying magnitude of the truth. No one in the entire Russo organization, not the fiercely loyal Jackson, not the consigliere, not even his mother, knew Isabella existed. Damien's entire life was built on a foundation of lethal deception, and his greatest secret was his deepest love. Eliza now understood her promotion. Damien hadn't risked his life with her for her cleaning skills. He had risked it because he knew the danger lay inside his own blood and his inner circle. He had been paying the housemaids double to clean his room specifically to hide the medical receipts, the cryptic hospital communications, and the small, telltale trinkets from Isabella's bedside. He believed the maid, the transient, invisible servant, was less of a risk than his own lieutenants.
His Tuesday trips weren't power plays. They were desperate pleas to doctors, silent hours spent with his dying daughter. Eliza felt a wave of nausea and pity, an emotion she absolutely couldn't afford. She had seen the raw, naked fear of a father, a fear that contradicted the cold, hard reality of the mafia boss. He had built his impenetrable fortress only to find his greatest weakness was the tiny, fragile life he hid inside. He had risked a betrayal by a housemaid rather than a betrayal by his own lieutenants, because he understood that in his world, love wasn't a gift, it was leverage. The one thing that could destroy the mighty Don was not a rival family's bullet, but the health of his child. This secret changed everything about the man she was supposed to betray or save. He was a ruthless monster, but he was also a desperate, lonely protector. She had saved his life, but now she held the secret to his heart, a secret that could either save them both or guarantee her death for knowing too much. She was now emotionally and irrevocably invested in the lie that held the Russo family together.
Her search wasn't over. The adrenaline from discovering Isabella was quickly replaced by a cold, investigative focus. As she watched from a discreet distance, trying to process the devastating vulnerability she had witnessed, she saw another figure enter the sterile hospital corridor. Marcus, the young, clean-cut lawyer. Marcus shouldn't know this place exists. His presence here defied every rule of Damien's secrecy and every ounce of common sense. His presence here was a contradiction that screamed danger. His casual confidence in this secured sanctuary defied logic. Eliza watched, breath held tight in her chest, as he stopped, not at Isabella's room, but at the nurse's station. His demeanor was relaxed, familiar, the posture of a man who belonged. A moment later, a woman in specialized scrubs, the chief nurse for the pediatric intensive care unit, walked out, and Marcus exchanged a long, intimate kiss with her, a gesture of ownership and deep familiarity. The truth hit Eliza with the force of a physical blow. The chief nurse, the person with ultimate, daily access to Isabella's medical records and her life support schedule, was Marcus's lover. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Eliza's mind with brutal, terrifying force. The poison wasn't meant to kill Damien immediately. It was a distraction, a warning, a way to occupy his energy while the real threat was secured. The silent, elegant death was planned to be carried out here, in the cold safety of the hospital, by the one person Damien trusted implicitly with his life, or his child's life. Marcus hadn't needed access to the penthouse safe. He had access to the ventilator. The clean, sterile hospital environment was the real front line in the Mafia war. Eliza realized she was witnessing the ultimate link between the Mafia's power structure and the hospital's sterile environment, and she was the only one who could break the terrible connection. She had to move, but her hands trembled as she realized the true target wasn't the Don's syndicate, it was his innocent, fragile daughter. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, panicked beat that felt loud enough to reveal her location. Her mind raced, discarding old assumptions. The Mendozas wouldn't use poison. They were known for brutal public displays, for explosives and open warfare. The almond-scented poison in the penthouse was a measured, surgical strike, a test, a distraction. The real target was here, in the sterile, quiet hospital. The vulnerability was too perfect, the timing too precise. Marcus wasn't just connected to the betrayal, he was the cold, calculating orchestrator. He had used his clean suit and his lawyer title as armor, moving through the Russo family's defenses unnoticed. Desperate to confirm her devastating suspicion, Eliza hid near a bubbling water fountain in the lobby, pulling out her phone and setting it to record the low, intimate conversation Marcus was having with the nurse, his accomplice. The words that followed were worse than any death threat. Marcus, to the nurse, his voice dangerously soft, laced with ambition. I told you, she's the only leverage. The girl is the key to taking him out. He loves her too much to risk her life. His tone was devoid of any human empathy, discussing the fragile Isabella as if she were a pawn on a chessboard. If we control the life support, we control the city. He wasn't just after the syndicate, he was after the boss's soul. The chilling words confirmed it. Marcus, the trusted, seemingly loyal lawyer, was a collaborator, and he was using the boss's sick daughter as his ultimate, unforgivable weapon. He hadn't wanted Damien dead in the penthouse. He needed him alive and distracted, desperate enough to eventually hand over the empire to ensure his daughter's care. The poisoning was merely a signal to Damien that his secure world was fragile, while the real danger lay quietly, attached to tubes in a San Diego hospital bed. The betrayal was an act of cold genius, a surgical strike against the Don's heart. Eliza felt a wave of icy terror. She was no longer just dealing with a mafia boss and a traitor. She was dealing with a monster willing to sacrifice a child. She was holding the most devastating secret in the entire criminal underworld, a secret that could either save Isabella or guarantee Eliza's own execution for knowing too much. She knew she had to move, but exposing Marcus meant revealing Isabella, and exposing Isabella meant condemning the child. The digital recording now humming on her phone was her only weapon, and her only death warrant. Eliza raced back to the penthouse. The time for silent investigation, for feather dusters and hidden recording was over. Her heart still pounded with the recorded evidence of Marcus's chilling betrayal. She didn't seek out the study or the security room. She confronted Damien, not as the Don, but as the man, choosing his private bedroom where he was at his most unguarded, removing his vulnerability. She didn't lead with the poison or the name of the traitor. She went straight to the heart, delivering the truth like a bullet. You have a daughter, Isabella, at the San Diego Children's Hospital, and Marcus knows. He's working with the chief nurse to use her life support as leverage. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Damien's face, already pale from the lingering poison, drained completely of color. The color fled even from his lips. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the chest, the shock so profound he couldn't even manage a sound. He didn't deny it, he didn't question how she knew, he simply absorbed the fatal blow. His immediate fury was volcanic, but it was directed not at Eliza, but at inward, at his own colossal failure. He slammed his fist into the solid mahogany nightstand, a sickening crack that spoke more of fractured bone than fractured wood. His own weakness, his own blinding secrecy, had put his only child on a killer's chessboard. His devastating realization that he had allowed a monster access to his only child for years, believing his silence was protection, was absolute. Marcus, he finally growled, the name a poisoned vow. He knew. He was waiting. He grabbed Eliza's shoulders, his touch fierce but not harmful. The moment I saved my life with your paste, he knew I would start searching. The poisoning was a test, to see if I would panic, to see if I would look anywhere but the one place I couldn't afford to look. His eyes were molten with self-hatred and a terrifying cold resolve. Eliza realized she had just traded her life of fear for a life of shared, consuming vengeance. Damien fought to control the tremor in his hands, which were now gripping the edge of the dresser, not in pain, but in sheer, contained rage. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't ask about the betrayal. Those facts were cold and understood. He asked one thing, his voice barely audible, a profound question that cut through the silence. Why did you tell me? She could have used the secret, the existence of his daughter, the vulnerability of his heart, to blackmail him, to buy her immediate freedom, a new identity, and a fortune that would secure her family for generations. Instead, she stood before him, the embodiment of a moral compass he had discarded decades ago. Eliza looked him straight in the eye, her resolve unshakable. She is a sick child. She is innocent. I don't trade on children, Don Russo. With those words, she had drawn a moral line in the sand of his dark, blood-soaked world, separating herself absolutely from the traitors and the syndicate's greed. Damien's rigid control finally broke. His face softened, the harsh lines around his eyes easing slightly. He saw the genuine, unshakable goodness in her heart. He saw the one thing he had lost, unconditional loyalty. A profound respect, a dangerous form of love, flashed across his expression. You saved me from my own blindness, Housemaid. You showed me the truth when everyone else was selling me a lie. He stepped toward her, his proximity overwhelming, yet she held her ground. I need more than a housemaid now, Eliza. I need a guardian for her and for me. He dropped his voice to a vow. Now, help me save her. He wasn't asking, he was committing to her. He chose the maid over his trusted lieutenants, over established protocol, and over everything his world stood for.
Their fates were now irreversibly bound, sealed by the life of a sick child and a shared secret of the heart. The time for stealth was absolutely over. The immense penthouse was no longer quiet. It was a hive of controlled, lethal activity. Damien and Eliza quickly prepared the final, lethal trap for Marcus, using Isabella's critical condition as the inevitable bait. The plan was devastatingly simple. They would leak false information about Isabella's sudden recovery, forcing Marcus to accelerate his attack at a time and place of Damien's choosing. As the guards assembled, their movements sharp, focused, and armed with a cold fury, Jackson watched the improbable scene unfold. Eliza, the maid he had despised, was commanding the room with a nurse's calm, coordinating the specialized medical response team that would accompany the rescue. She moved among the armed men, her mind focused only on pediatric care protocols, utterly unfazed by the weapons. Jackson's suspicion warred with a grudging respect he couldn't hide. Damien sought her out, his massive presence overshadowing the tactical maps. He pulled her away from the chaos, his hand grasping hers, his touch burning with possessive intensity. His eyes, usually ice, were fierce, reflecting a terrifying new certainty. "Listen to me, Eliza. Whatever happens, you are my safe harbor. You are my only truth." He wasn't just stating a fact, he was forging a bond that superseded the syndicate, the law, and all his past loyalties. He gave the final command, his voice cold and resolute, leaving no room for argument. "You are coming with us, but you will stay in the vehicle until the signal. I need your eyes on that hospital. I need your brain to keep that little girl alive. Your knowledge is our only advantage." He looked at her, his declaration final, binding her to his world forever. "I don't need a housemaid anymore. I need a queen." He lifted her hand and pressed a dark, encrypted phone into her palm, her communication link, her lifeline, her new crown. The Don had chosen his protector, and the housemaid was about to ride into a mafia war. The scene was set. Marcus, confident he held the winning hand, met Damien in a remote, dimly lit safe house outside of San Diego, ready to trade his silence for the control of the entire Russo syndicate. The negotiation was a lie, a carefully constructed stage for an ambush. Marcus wore a smug look, certain he had the ultimate leverage, a sick child's heartbeat. But he didn't count on the cold, calculated fury of a betrayed father, nor the silent, unpredictable courage of the housemaid waiting just beyond the perimeter. "You lose, Don Russo," Marcus sneered, his voice echoing in the concrete room. "You can't touch me without signing your daughter's death warrant." That was the signal. As Marcus drew his hidden weapon, a final, lethal confrontation erupted. Jackson and the loyal guards moved with practiced precision, but Damien, driven by a primal, blinding need to protect his child, moved first, abandoning all tactical restraint. He became a blur of brutal, efficient violence. The traitor was cornered, his ambition collapsing around him. But in the chaos of the takedown, Marcus executed his final, monstrous move. With his final breath, he pressed a concealed button on his wrist and gave one final desperate order over his hidden earpiece, an order to the chief nurse to immediately cut Isabella's life support. The life of the child was now a timer counting down to 0. Damien saw the raw horror in Eliza's eyes, who had been monitoring the team's internal comms from the armored SUV. The terror was replaced by a furious, absolute certainty. He didn't hesitate. He'd go, save her, he roared, throwing her the keys to a separate, unmarked vehicle, a black sports car designed for impossible speed. Eliza sprinted out of the ambush site. She didn't hesitate towards freedom, towards a new identity, or towards the fortune promised by the Dawn. She sprinted towards the hospital, towards the child, towards the moral line she had drawn in the sand. Damien had given her the keys to her freedom, but she was using them for his daughter. The mafia boss had given the housemaid the ultimate command, the ultimate test. She was racing against time on the winding California highway, the encrypted phone Damien had given her ringing constantly with frantic, useless updates. Every minute was a lifetime. She thought of Isabella's fragile body, the hissing ventilator, and the cold, calculating hand of the nurse reaching for the life switch. The weight of the entire Russo family's future, the fragile innocence of a little girl, and the cold, possessive heart of the mafia boss all rested on the speed of her borrowed sports car. Could she reach the hospital in time to save Isabella, the innocent heart of the syndicate? Or would she lose the one battle that truly mattered, leaving her forever indebted to the darkness of the Russo family? The silent housemaid was now racing against time, fighting for the Don's life, his heart, and his heir. Don't miss the next chapter to find out if Eliza saves Isabella and claims her place as the queen of the Russo family. Please tell me where you are watching from, like, subscribe, and share this video.